Hi everyone, it's Jeanette here from the Sewn Studio with, as promised, part 2 of the Advent calendar panel. Now in part 1 we just made the pockets and stitched those down, so they're all on now. And in this section I thought what I would show you is talk a little bit about some quilting ideas, and then we're going to make some hanging tabs, and then we're going to do the final assembly and actually turn it into the panel itself that we can hang. So the quilting. I've once again used my gold embroidery thread. Now what I should have said also in part 1, which I'm not sure if I did, is I just used a normal sewing cotton in the bobbin. So I only put the embroidery thread in the top of the machine, and I found with my machine it seemed to like that perfectly fine. So the normal 50 weight cotton that I use for piecing, just in a neutral colour, I had that in the bobbin. I don't think we've had a question on it yet, but there may be some of you out there that are wondering about that. So I've used that same gold embroidery thread again, because you know it's Christmas, so we can do that. Now let me just try and get this pretty central. And if you have a look here under the close-up, I've just gone round some of the elements in the panel itself, because this is a really good panel. There's quite a lot of ideas here that you can just take to use for the quilting. So what I thought I would do on this one is just go around some of the star shapes we've got here. I'm probably going to go around the pot along the bottom as well. But just to say, this is such a decorative panel anyway, you don't really need to do any quilting apart from, if you're using quilt wadding, just some stitching to hold the layers together. Now you'll also notice that I haven't put the backing on yet because we're going to bag this out. So we need to quilt the top and the wadding separately. We're going to add the backing separately later. So I've just picked out some of the elements. Now the other thing I've done, and I'll flip this over in a minute because you'll probably be able to see it more clearly on the back because I've used the gold thread, is here on some of these shapes, I've just done some little straight stitches because there's these lovely gold lines for you to follow. So, you know, you don't have to do anything complicated. If you wanted to practice free motion, you've got all these lovely sort of swirls with leaves and sort of twigs and leaves. So you could practice on those shapes, or you could even get your embroidery threads out and do some hand embellishing on it. You could add beads, you could add sequins, you know, you could really dress this up, or just, as I said, just use it as it is. Now just another word about the backing. Now on the panel itself, on the instructions which come on the top, they do suggest that you put some wadding in behind it. But if you didn't want to quilt it at all, you could use a fusible interfacing or a fusible fleece and put that on it, and then you perhaps could get away with not doing any quilting at all. But if you just wanted to quilt very simply without picking out any of the details, all I've done here on this one is I've just gone around, there's sort of 3 gold lines here, and I've just gone with a straight stitch around the frame. So there's 2 lines around the Christmas tree, and then there's 1 on the outer edge here. Now I haven't bothered out here because that will end up in a seam allowance in a minute for when we sort of turn it through. So the panel itself, as I said, gives lots of suggestions on how to quilt it. You can do as much or as little, or you could even just go over with an all-over pattern if you wanted to do it like that. Now the other suggestion I thought of afterwards, after I put all the pockets on, is you could actually put the panel onto the wadding and then stitch your pockets on so the pockets themselves hold it to the wadding as well. So that would also be another option for you. So that's just a very quick overview of some of the quilting things that you could do, some of the embellishing you might be able to do on it. So really it's just grab your panel, they're absolutely beautiful, and just decorate to your heart's content. So I'm going to trim this up, and then we will have a look at hanging tabs. I'm going to make 3 hanging tabs to go onto this, so we'll have a look at that next. Okay, so we're going to add the hanging tabs to this. But this is a generic one. This is just the Advent panel, but of course this could be any small wall quilt. You could do exactly the same technique for adding your hanging tabs. Now there's no specific formula I use in terms of the size of the hanging tabs. I really just sort of look at it and look at what's proportionally right, but generally, as a general rule of thumb, anywhere between sort of 2.5 to 3 inches I find makes a good sized hanging tab. Now these I've made 10 inches in length because I don't want too much of a drop, but between sort of 10 and 12 inches also makes sort of a nice size for a hanging tab. So let me show you how I've made these. Now we want to start with a piece of fabric that's going to be sort of twice the width of your finished width for your hanging tab, plus add 1/2 inch for your seam allowance. So I wanted about 2 3/4 inches for this. So I've cut a piece of fabric that is 6 inches across and 10 inches in length. So that's the piece of fabric. Now this fabric is lovely. It's actually from the same range that the Advent panel's from. Also, I've cut myself a little bit of interfacing. Now you could get away without putting the interfacing in, but I just feel it just gives it a bit more strength, a bit more durability. And also for the Advent panel, of course, you've got little gifts and stuff that can go into there, which is going to add a little bit more weight. But even if this wasn't an Advent panel, if this was just a general mini quilt that I was putting on the wall, I would still put the interfacing in. So we're just going to iron that on the back, and I always cut my interfacing just a little bit smaller than my piece of fabric. And the instructions on this one says to put it on with a medium heat and hold it for 8 seconds. Now this is the Vlisaline F220 is what I'm using here, and that's just what I had at hand at home, so that's why I grabbed for that one. But any sort of medium weight interfacing will do. Now I would just say, I always like to sort of hit it on the top of the iron once I've put that on, is just test your interfacing. Some of them, and particularly some of the lightweight ones, they can be a bit sensitive to heat and can sort of crumple on you a little bit. So sort of test a little piece out first, and if you find that it can't sort of hold the heat very well, you can press it from the fabric side and just hold it there long enough to allow that adhesive to melt and go into the fabric. So once we've got it like that, I'm just moving this about, let me just move that right out the way for a minute because we don't need it. I'm just going to fold it so those two long edges meet, and then we're going to just sew down that long edge with a 1/4 inch seam. And then once we've got it like that, I'm just going to turn it through with my trusty chopstick. Every sewing room should have a chopstick. Not for your takeaway. Well, it could be for your takeaway. So I tend to just finger press that seam, and then I'm just going to position that fabric so that that seam is lying nice and centrally along the edge. Now you could have it so that the seam goes up the back, but I sort of feel that that's still quite visible, so I like to sort of disguise it a bit more. And then once I sort of feel that I've got that where I want it to be, I'm going to hit that with the iron. Now once we've got it like this, I'm just going to top stitch down either edge. Now if I just bring in the 3 that I've made for this wall hanging, you can see I've actually top stitched it with my gold embroidery thread on top, but I've just used a plain green on the back. Now one thing just to note about the embroidery threads, they're not quite as strong, I don't feel, as our piecing cottons, our 50 weight piecing cottons. So I do tend to use it more as a decorative element. I wouldn't actually sew any seams with it, just to say that. Now I think I've got green in the machine, so I'll leave the green in there. And we're just going to run this through. Just taking my stitch length up to a 3.0. And there it is, all top stitched. Now you don't have to do the top stitch, but I like to do it. One, I think it finishes it and gives it a nice finished look, but also it just adds that little bit of strength as well. So once we've made those, now you could sew that as a whole sort of 30-inch piece and then cut it into 3. That works just as well. So let me set that one aside, and we're going to add it to our little wall hanging here, our calendar. Now I'm going to have it so that my gold threads are on the outside. And I'm just going to position it. I think I'm actually going to line it up with the edge of the pocket there. We don't want it too far in because you don't want your edges folding, so it needs to be in a position that it's going to hold the outside of your quilt quite well. So I think I'm just going to position it there. That should work. So I'm going to put a couple of pins in. And then the same with this one. Just going to put on this outside edge, and I'm just lining up the raw edges with the raw edges. And then this third one I'm just going to put in the centre. Now depending on how wide your quilt is, you might want to put 2, but I think actually for this side I think this is about 24 inches wide. I think 3 should be fine. So I've got the centre point here, it's between those 2 pockets because there's 6 pockets across, so you can just find the centre point, and I'm just going to put that one there. And then I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm just going to do a little tacking stitch. It's much easier than leaving pins in your work. So probably about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. So we've got our hanging tabs on, and I've just measured the quilt and cut a piece of backing fabric. Now this is the same that I've made the hanging tabs from, and this was a piece that I actually bought 30 inch by width of fabric, and that's big enough to do the back of the advent panel and the hanging tabs. So 30 inches was, it needs to be a bit bigger than half a metre. So I went for 3/4 of a metre. So I'm just going to line these two up, and I'm going to start actually where the hanging tabs are, just to make sure that they're secured down and they're not going to flip up on me. That's a tongue twister, while I'm sewing. So all I'm going to do is pin this down, and then I'm going to take it to the machine, sew all the way around, and on the bottom I'm going to leave about a 4 or 5 inch gap here, and that's going to be so that we can turn it through. It's quite a large panel, so you need to leave a decent sized gap. There we are, so we've gone all the way round. Now I don't know if you noticed, but actually when it came to the area where I've got my hanging tabs, I just did do a little bit of backwards and forwards just to sort of reinforce those stitches, because that's what's going to be taking the weight of everything. So I just like to add a bit extra sewing there. Now I'm just going to just snip across the corners. And that's just to reduce the bulk, otherwise you'll have sort of very lumpy corners. And you just want to go close to the stitches, but obviously not through them. And now it's ready to turn through. So fingers crossed. Where's my gap? Down there. This is also where your chopstick comes in useful, poking out corners. Now I tend to just go through and sort of finger press all my seams first. I just sort of feel it, they just sort of lay a bit flatter when you do that rather than taking them straight to the iron. I'm just going to check our hanging tabs are all nice and caught. And they are. Now you could leave one of your rounds of quilting until you've put the back on and then go through and do that bit, and that would just secure that backing fabric to the back, but this isn't a huge quilt, so not necessary, but it is an option for you. And then I'm just gonna, and I just tend to put my fingers in the side there and give the fabric a pull, and it will sort of, it'll want to sort of fold where that seam is. And then I'm just going to put a couple of pins in, and then I'm going to take it to the iron and press it, but just be careful, these aren't, you can get magic pins that you can iron on, but these are not them. So if you did iron these pins, you'd end up with a little ball of plastic on your ironing board. So here's our advent panel all finished. I'm really pleased with it because it's hanging really nice and flat. And that's always what we want from a wall hanging, isn't it? So those 3 tabs are working really well. Now, just to say, I've still got the gap in the bottom. To close that up, you could either do a top stitch all the way around, about 1/8 of an inch all the way around, or you can just go back and close that by hand, or you could just machine across it just to finish it. But as I said, really pleased with how this has come out. So all that's left for me to do, now I'm a sewist, so of course I'm going to be filling my pockets with some nice little sewing notions. I found this nice little magnetic needle minder. So they're going to go all in here. So I'm going to have some great fun filling up all my pockets, but I'm ready for Advent now. I hope you give this a go. If you do, please do share your photos. And I hope you'll join us again here next time in the Sewing Studio.